Hello and welcome back to Heights Library's podcast, Unpacking 1619, where you can explore the interviews we've collected with scholars from around the country, in which we unpack topics relating to race in America. I'm your host, John Pichet, and I'm thrilled to share these interviews with you here. On today's episode, I'm privileged to have Michael Omi from UC Berkeley and Howard Winant from UC Santa Barbara to discuss their foundational sociological text, Racial Formation in the United States. Unlike other traditional race theories, in Omi and Winant's view, racial meanings pervade U.S. society, from defining individual racial identities to the structuring of collective political action. Race as a master category, the rise of colorblindness, and how the right weaponizes civil rights advancements are all discussed. Here's our discussion from September 9, 2025.
I'm Michael Omi. I'm a professor emeritus of ethnic studies and Asian American and Asian diaspora studies at UC Berkeley.
And I'm Howard Winant, also professor emeritus of sociology. I'm affiliated with all the ethnic studies programs at my university, which is UC Santa Barbara. That would be Black Studies, Chicano Studies, and Asian American Studies.
Well, it's quite an honor to talk to you, gentlemen, because you wrote one of the seminal books on race, which is this one, Racial Formation in the United States. So I'd love for you guys to tell us, I read the third edition, how does it differ than the first edition?
Yeah, we're going to have to draw straws to see who wants to go on this question. Howie, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so, this book has had a very long history. It comes out of not only academic work we were doing, but also political work, activist, anti-racist work that we were doing way back in the 1970s when we were still quite wet behind the ears. First edition came out in 1986, second in 1994, and the third edition in 2014. Of course, it's undergone many changes over that time period because it's attuned, not in a journalistic way, but in a more like critical theory type of way to U.S. Racial politics and racial consciousness, let's say. So that was very different in 1986 than it was in 2014, not to mention today in 2025. But the basic structure of the book, the basic logic of the book remains the same. It begins with a critical overview of existing race theories, approaches to race. Then it shifts over to proposing our approach, which in many ways synthesizes past approaches, but also, as I say, criticizes them. And then based on our approach, it presents a recent history, let's say, going back to about World War II or so, maybe after that, of U.S. racial dynamics and the vicissitudes of race and racism over that decades-long period.
Yeah, I think that's, what led to the updates and stuff is the ways in which we try to do a political trajectory, a kind of history of the kinds of movements for racial justice, but also the ways in which racial reaction is set in too. So we were trying to capture that. In many ways, though, some of the basic contours of the concepts and theories have pretty much remained the same, although we were responding to our critics as well, and to rethink some of the assumptions we had made in the kind of earlier edition, and also to emphasize some things over others.
Yeah, and I'd like to drill down on some of those things that you brought into the conversation. But before we begin in that, let's talk a little bit about how you came to form your idea of racial formation, and you pick out three kind of, I think for a layperson, they may be a little bit difficult to understand, these paradigms of race.
Mhm.
And it's a way of negotiating and navigating the history, which I thought was really brilliant. So if you could talk about how you came up with those three kind of buckets, to use a terrible business term, and to use those to drill into this really complicated and fraught racial history of the United States.
Well, in some ways, John, there's almost a step you have to take back before dealing with the paradigms of race themselves. And both Howie and I were trained in sociology, and we really were quite disappointed with the ways in which the concept of race was treated. In other words, there was almost this assumption that race was an independent variable, and one's studies had to be about race and incarceration rates, race and racial residential segregation, without really examining to any degree what is race. And of course, the other fallback was much more the kinds of notions of race as something fixed and biological. And that's been a kind of the long history of attempts to racially classify in the humankind. And so we were trying to think about race as something that had to be constructed. I think the key word here is formation, that it's not fixed, it's nothing stable, but in fact, it's always being formed and reformed. And then to ask, all right, so you have this notion of a kind of social construction of race, if you will. So what? And the key question there was, well, what contributes? How do we understand how race, concepts of race, and racial meanings have been transformed over historical time? And that got us into the first part of that, to think about race as something which is shaped by the kind of social order one finds oneself in, how it compares across other kinds of nation states. But also, we're trying to critique some of the more common racial paradigms, if you will, or theories about race that tended to neglect race, that sort of reduced race to ethnicity or to class or to nation, but not taking on the concept of race in its own right.
It's interesting because everyone, since we live in a racial regime, a society deeply structured by race, and this is, by the way, not just true of the United States, but in most places around the world, we tend to take it for granted as if we know what race means and what racial identity people have simply automatically. It's like looking at somebody, you know what their race is because you read it off of their body. But, in many ways, this is an illusion, a sort of a false common sense view of race that when looked at more systematically, falls apart. I mean, different groups have been racialized in different ways and de-racialized in different ways over time. For example, the Irish used to be a race, and now the Irish have been incorporated into whiteness in the United States. Maybe not quite so much in the UK, but still quite a bit there too. I could give you many other examples of groupings of people which are that are racially ambiguous. For example, sorry about the phone ringing in the background there. For example, people from the Middle East, what we now call Swana, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, you know, Arabs, for example, are racialized to some extent, though not officially considered a racial group by the U.S. Census Bureau. Just to pick that example, one could go on and on with this list. The Supreme Court has had to intervene, has dealt with cases over and over where it was asked to define race in the same way that it's sometimes been asked to define, pornography. A famous Supreme Court justice once said, "I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it." Well, that's a definition of a non-definition, really, of a common sense meaning to race. So it's that flexibility, that instability, that mutability over time that was not the only driver, but one of the drivers for our work. It was also obviously political conflict, inequality, social justice issues that were driving our project.
I think the use of the kind of history of the U.S. Census is very instructive in this regard because almost every census has had controversies regarding what the categories would be used, and in some ways, what we were trying to capture is those kinds of group labels, but also the ways in which there's a kind of tension or negotiation between the state, let's say, that wants to impose its understanding of how to aggregate the population in the United States, and movements from below, popular movements in which people are trying to express their own individual and collective identities in ways that would be recognized or legible to the state, to the census. So that kind of motion between the state imposition of categories, challenges from below, how that gets contested and worked out was a large part also of how we saw race in formation.
Just to add a little more, I don't want to go on, but when you think about it, it's not just how we see each other and how we see ourselves. It's also, or that is, race is also deeply economic and political factor in American life on a world scale. I mean, what race has enabled in many ways is slavery and colonial rule, empire, and resistance to these things. So it's not just how I see myself; it's I see myself as under the lash. I can't stand that. I have to resist that. That's not fair to me. That doesn't treat me, doesn't accept me as a human being. It reduces me to a thing, a project, a chattel. So the stakes of this are so enormous. And again, much of this goes under the rug as we think about race in commonsensical terms.
Well, and I think what you guys are describing, kind of which was going to be my next question, which was this race as master category, and how it, especially in the United States, creates this whole system, as you were just saying, Howard, about like resistance and oppression and resistance, and this give and take between the two, but at the same time is completely deniable but undeniable. So it has its own it has a contradiction built into it, which seems to be part of the absolute identity of race. Is that right?
Well, oh, yeah, interesting about the notion about race as a master category. We were trying very carefully, I thought, not to suggest that, one shouldn't think about issues around class or gender and sexuality or other things in constituting both collectivities and individual identities. But it was to say from the very inception of this country that particularly notions of race had a profound effect on shaping other forms of stratification and difference. You know, I mean, certainly not. Going really back. It's about the seizure of indigenous lands and the kind of dispossession on the part of settlers. It's also about slave versus non-slave and how it transformed from notions of indentured servitude to real fixed conceptions of racially based slavery. And it's also the class structure of the United States, depending on how you want to define that. But also in other arrangements too, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality. So it wasn't to say that that was determinant of everything, but that it served as a template. It's one. Systems and structures of exploitation or oppression was shaped a lot about by race. Think about the ways in which the modern civil rights movement, for example, had a profound effect on environmental movements, second wave of feminism, other movements as well. So it's like a category not only of control, but can also be seen as a category that can be used to forge forms of resistance.
And self-definition, we are defined from above by race in certain ways. I mean, certainly, if you think of Black people, you see that as, how the American experience was forged as a very complex system of, uh, as I say, chattel slavery and denial of basic humanity on the one hand, but also how that defined those who ran the system, what we would now call white people. I mean, the most important thing about being white in America, maybe even today, derives from the fact that there was this free versus slave category. I mean, we think we've eliminated that, but we see numerous instances where the denial of rights is premised on recognition of race. So here, I mean, think about, the current ice raids we're seeing and this kind of thing. So, I mean, here is this crazy system that on the one hand is commonsensical, taken for granted, not really questioned, thought to be absolute and natural. And on the other hand is the foundation for a society that in practice contradicts many of its most fundamental beliefs and the premises of democracy and the Constitution and all that kind of stuff. Of course, the Constitution itself is a racial document, I hasten to add.
We've covered that a little bit with Eric Ferner. So I'd love to get into the paradigms now, because I think where we've kind of set ourselves up for is how these three different ones you look at: ethnicity, class, and nation-based. As you were saying prior, were looked at with race being a component of it in a way that it hadn't been before. So could you explain how you use these three paradigms to kind of discuss racial formation and how your thinking kind of evolved through these three?
You start, Michael, then I'll pick up on some of ethnicity and then.
Right. Maybe we should just say, we were suggesting, particularly through the, much of American sociology as unfolded in the 20th century was centered a lot around of transforming race actually into forms of ethnicity, thinking about ethnic differences and cultural-based differences. And that we thought that in each of these accounts, in class-based accounts and ethnicity-based accounts, we argue that race takes a kind of backseat, if you will, to another sort of fundamental principle of group-based identity or organization. And that what it did was, as I said, was to minimize how we might consider race in its own regard and its own history and transformation over time. But definitely, many of these things keep, before we get into, let me just say that each of these kinds of paradigms too continues to haunt the present. I mean, we think about whether, for example, how do we explain, disparities, black-white disparities? Is it in terms of class or is it in terms of race? And what does taking each of those approaches mean for the kind of policy recommendations one would advance in order to sort of alleviate those glaring gaps and so forth? So, but maybe we should just do a quick treatment of this. You wanna do class, Howie?
Sure. Well, I was just saying that for all three of these paradigms that we're proposing, and this is like an analysis, okay, but I'm not saying that there's some thing out there called, the ethnicity paradigm of race or the class paradigm of race, the nation paradigm of race. These are ways of categorizing and grouping common phenomena, so the common phenomena so as to understand race better. So, I mean, if you think about it that way, each one of them, ethnicity, class, and nation, they each attempt to explain race as based in something else. And the something else for ethnicity is culture. So people are of different culture. That's why Black people are different from white people, or Latinos are different, or Asians are different from white people. They have different cultures, and this is what we really mean, not color, not physical things, but culture and class, and so also this enables certain kinds of deprecation, put downs, inequalities, inequality, and so on. But then once you get into inequality, that it takes you into the class paradigm. And the class paradigm would suggest that race is a matter of, as I say, inequality, stratification, levels of success and failure in a society. Why are Black people different from white people? Because they're not as successful, and of course, many racist stereotypes come into view here, laziness and so on, accusations of that kind of thing, which are actually ridiculous when you think about how hard it is to make it in a society when you're discriminated against group. But so if you ground your understanding of race in inequality, that is a basically economic paradigm. And there's a tremendous literature, of course, in economics about this, about how Black people, or again, immigrants or Native Americans, whomever you want to talk about, have been able to compete successfully in the economy. Then the nation paradigm, I think, is the most confusing in a lot of ways. Of course, there is a sort of territory, nation state kind of view of nations. So we think of different nations as, Hungary or Bulgaria or Nigeria or something like that. But and there is some overlap between that idea of nation and racial groups, because there have been powerful white nationalist movements and black nationalist movements that seek to impose a kind of homogeneity on our society or on, to escape from our society and create something separate. That is, that is a peoplehood kind of notion. But once you're forging, once you're basing your idea of race on peoplehood in that way, there's a deep political dimension to that. Stephen Miller made a speech at the Republican convention. America is for Americans and Americans only. He never used a racial term in that. But what he meant, of course, was that white people are the only true Americans. And there's been a whole lot of writing and political agitation over that, nativist movements. I could go on and on. But when you look at that peoplehood category, and you look at what you're doing with that, you're really saying these are people who have rights and should have rights. These are the people who don't have rights, shouldn't have rights, or can't get their rights. So we should have a black nation in the American Southeast or something like that. So I mean, it's not just nationalism, fascism, authoritarianism that can be nationalist. It can be nation-oriented, but it's also resistance, as we've seen in many, many movements over the years. And none of these three paradigms are really wrong in the sense that they don't recognize fundamental aspects of this complex category of race. But at the same time, we argue they're partial and they're dismissive about the complexities and depth and breadth of race, not only in the U.S., but across the world.
Well, thank you for that, because I think that leads to, so one of the questions I've heard, or one of the things I've heard a lot, and we're going to kind of jump ahead here to post-Obama, is, we have now conquered race. There's some way in which the American society has solved the racial problem, and we no longer have Jim Crow, we no longer have segregation, schools are integrated, you can become president of the United States if you're a minority, and I could go on and on and on with this kind of argument. I think you know where I'm going with this, which is we are now living in a colorblind society. And I think one of the most powerful tools you kind of introduce is this rearticulation that happens. So if you could talk to us a little bit about how we get to a colorblind society, what the argument about that fundamentally is, and the role of rearticulation.
That's a big one. So, we've used this concept of rearticulation, particularly with respect to understanding political struggles around race and racial meanings. So, for example, that different groups latch on or cultivate an analysis based on a particular kind of set of meanings in order to advance certain kinds of political claims. It's interesting, John, that you mentioned that there's this kind of notion of color blindness. And it was certainly true during the sort of post-Obama era that, every sort of, people on the right or something would say, quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on about his children being judged by the content of the character and not by the color of their skin, as a way to suggest why we needed to, in the current period, get rid of DEI, for example, which makes us much more color conscious and exploits, it is said, those kinds of differences against us. That's a form of rearticulation, I think, from where Dr. Martin Luther King was arguing about the notions about race and colorblindness to a point where now I think even under the current regime, there's ways in which people think, no, we're not a colorblind society, and it's like whites who are being discriminated against in all these policy decisions. And so we're trying to right a wrong again. It's kind of like, and this is, the pervasiveness of a lot of the white nationalist movements, certainly, but it's entered into sort of normal mainstream politics. And in that way, this theme somehow that racial injustice continues. It's only the subjects of that racial injustice that now need to be protected, addressed, and their grievances understood. So and to be quite honest, when Howie and I were first writing about things of color blindness, I don't think we anticipated the depth and breadth of the kind of political reaction which would take place, which would make us sort of fundamentally rethink the very trajectory of racial politics in the United States and where that is going.
It's fascinating, this colorblind concept. It originally comes, as far as I know, from a dissent in a famous 1896 Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, a separate but equal case. And the dissenter, Justice Harlan, you basically imported a metaphor from something quite different, which is, an optical defect that some people cannot perceive the whole range of colors. If some animals can't see, I don't know, green or whatever it is. But it may have some wishful thinking elements in it. Many students have told us over the years that, I don't see color, you can be whatever color you want. It can even be purple. They always had purple in there. But I treat everyone as an individual, everyone as just their own person. And there's something in that one wants to honor. But at the same time, of course, we do see, no matter what Justice Harlan had to say or anyone else has to say, we do see color. We see it not only in people, but we see it in neighborhoods. We see it in, again, cultural issues, getting us back into the ethnicity paradigm there. We see it in political activity in all kinds of ways, gerrymandering by race or something like that. So it's been kind of ironic, it's not contradictory, it's not disgusting that the same people who are claiming colorblindness, to be colorblind and to be stepped above, have flown above this rude issue of race, they busily draw lines around or through neighborhoods of color in order to manipulate those votes or something like that. And it's just they're living on two different planets when they operate that way. Now, rearticulation is a little bit different thing. I mean, it's really it's a theoretical concept that comes out of political science types of analysis and movement types of analysis of political battles themselves. But it's really interesting to see how an idea that once meant one thing can turn into meaning, or be turned into meaning the opposite. And both states and ruling groups and political parties employ it, and also movements employ it. I mean, Michael was talking about Dr. King. The civil rights movement employed rearticulation very successfully with nonviolence, for example. I mean, the idea there was, to take the situation in which Black folk were seen as passive, unworthy, undeveloped, and uh, so powerless that they couldn't really be considered eligible for voting or economic equality or anything like that. They were too passive. They were too weak. And Dr. King took, I mean, it's not just Dr. King, it's a whole movement drawing on Gandhi and all of that, took that idea and turned it around, made it into a strength. We are peaceful, we're not violent, we're not threatening. But in our nonviolence, we're exhibiting a tremendous strength, you see. And we see this at the present with the attacks on the universities, for example, are re-articulating civil rights law to charge them with anti-Semitism because there were demonstrations against the Gaza bombings and destruction of Gaza by Israel, supported by the United States and also supported by many universities. So all of a sudden, if you took part in a demonstration against the Gaza war, you're an anti-Semite, even though many of those who demonstrated were self-Jewish. I'm Jewish myself, so let me hasten to add. But it's shocking to me as someone who's worked for so many years and been active for so many years on, desegregation, integration, inclusion, all those kinds of issues, to see this laws and policies that we fought for, people died for, really, suddenly get used to repress those very same people. DEI, that's just anti-white racism, et cetera, et cetera. So this is re-articulation. It's all around us, and it's often not noticed for what it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was reminded of, because I want to talk about the racial common sense, because I think when one of the fraught moments we're living in is this idea that we're faced with people who are just saying it like it is. They're just talking common sense. Why do these academics and everyone who's obsessed with race have these other arguments when it's just common sense? We're colorblind, we're this. But I was reminded of Justice Roberts' claim when they stripped out the affirmative action, or the voting rights, pre-clearance. He said the only way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race.
There we go. Maybe you should repeat the last question.
Yeah, let me repeat the last question, because it basically, I was coming back to racial common sense. Mm-hmm. And the idea that we have a Supreme Court who, in stripping pre-clearance from the Voting Rights Act, Justice Roberts said, the only way to stop discriminating on race is to stop discriminating on race. Mm-hmm. And it's this kind of like common sense rhetoric that is both, it seems obvious, but it is so far, it's so ideological in its like first principle, stripped down, reductionist sort of, you know where I'm going with it. So if you could talk to us about common sense and like where we are with the racial project and racial formation.
Well, certainly that last thing you mentioned about Justice Roberts was, in fact, drawn from this notion of color blindness, that the best principle we should employ is to not recognize race in some ways. But, when I've had discussions like this with students, what's been very interesting is to ask them how in their everyday life they get around in the world using racial cues or racial meanings. How do they navigate the racial landscape in their campus or in town or from their home communities from which they came? So, for example, one of the things we suggest on the very individual level is that really one of the first things we notice about people, aside from their sex, gender, is actually their race. And you know that because in many ways, people who are racially ambiguous, not easily classified from the existing palette of understanding who racial groups are continually asked about who they are. And so, you know, it's just like you confront somebody, you're not sure if it's a man or a woman. It's like you don't know who this person is. And we do use racial cues. I mean, all of us, regardless of our commitments to sort of, you know, racial justice or a sort of radical colorblindness, if you will. You know, we get around in the world that way. And it shapes who we think this person is, how we interact with them, and what we should expect from them. And I think that's very powerful to get people to understand that despite this kind of pervasive notion that we shouldn't recognize race, we do recognize race. And we recognize it every day.
Well, recognizing is not a stable thing, even
Well,
us as individuals. So that's very
sure.
important too. I mean, lots of people are mixed race. Lots of people are in relationships across racial lines of division. So, you know, are they going, you know, if, you know, a married couple, one is white, one is black, let's say, are they going to spend every minute of their lives thinking, oh, my husband's black. Oh my goodness, what does that mean about what he's just said he wanted for dinner? You know, so you can't, there is a logic to common sense that it is, you know, we need it to live. We need it to prioritize, you know, our daily practical lives in so many ways. And so I don't, you know, I don't want to dismiss quote unquote common sense approaches to race as never being valid or never being important. But on the other hand, John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States, has made his entire career, 50 years, of trying to block mainly black people, but other people of color as well, from entering the political system. You know, so I mean, it's pretty rich for this guy who I believe, maybe California or Arizona, as a young law student, was already challenging people at the polls that he deemed to be non-white. And he is now arguing 50 years later that the way not to discriminate is just not to discriminate. In other words, I don't want to bother. I don't want to bother with this troubling subject. And I think this man's got a lot on his conscience. But at the same time, as I say, it's unavoidable to look at race through a common sense lens. And it's not always bad. Race is an unstable thing. It's unstable over long arcs of history, and it's unstable from moment to moment in our social relationships that we have with our students, as Michael was saying, or even in our own selves. I have a mixed race grandchild, for example, and I wonder all the time, who is he going to be racially speaking? You know? So I mean, this is what you get for having a really complex thing going on that derives from, you know, half a millennium ago.
Oh, you're on mute, John.
Yeah, no, I'm not. So the Supreme Court just came out and said we can now do racial profiling in our ICE raids. I guess that came out today. So with that in mind and where we are kind of socially today, because you do speak about immigration in your work, and where do you find racial formation, Are we moving forward? Are we moving backward? Are we standing still? You say it's unstable. Is it collapsing or is it building up? Where do you guys put us as kind of like a final wrap up of this discussion?
Sort of it's everything all at once. But
That's right.
I mean, let's look at that Supreme Court decision, which puts a stay on the lower courts thing around, the suspicions about that there was some sort of racial and ethnic profile going on with respect to the ICE raids. If you see that too, they say that, well, it can't be that that's the determinant factor, but it's an ensemble of factors like whether or not, the type of labor they're engaged in, where they are. So in other words, here again, it tries to reduce race or put it in a package with other factors that as a totality would suggest that ICE has the authority to be able to detain and possibly deport those individuals. I think when Howie and I are talking about, I mentioned earlier about how in some ways, one of the things we've been talking about a lot is about sort of uh, it's not kind of not acknowledging or comprehending to the full extent the kind of depth and breadth of racial reaction we've been seeing. And I think that it speaks to a kind of reperiodization of how we look at U.S. racial history. And we had, for example, that brief moment of Reconstruction after the Civil War, only to be followed by the imposition of Jim Crow segregation and racial terror. In a similar fashion, we've witnessed, it seems, the demise of the kind of, if you will, perhaps a second Reconstruction at the close of World War II, deepening in the 50s and 60s, in which a civil rights movement became really important in sort of the transformation of a whole host of American institutions and practices. And what we're witnessing now is the kind of, it seems, the reaction to that, utilizing notions of rearticulation to stand the ideas on their heads and to argue for, it seems to us, a really dangerous kind of road towards, in some ways, white Christian nationalism, too. And that, as I said, the ways in which ideas which were once seen as extreme have now become normalized in our understanding. How we've shifted now, maybe that whereas Blacks or other folks of color were subject to kinds of historical forms of discrimination, it's kind of arguing that what we've just been through, this second Reconstruction, if you will, has led to the kind of marginalization of white folks with respect to the basic core values, institutions, and practices that is suggested have defined ourselves as American.
Without question, reforms, political reforms that happen, and not just in the United States, but around the world, that try to generate more social justice and more equality, generate reactions. And they do that because people who previously had, and it is another term that is now stigmatized, but needs to be on our minds, people who previously had privilege now see that privilege eroding, and they feel it's unjust. Or someone might get that job, well, that should have been my job, et cetera, et cetera. This goes into college admissions, it goes into all sorts of issues. So, and by the way, I think it's really important to recognize what a powerful gender dimension that has, as men who previously took their dominant social position, again, largely for granted, common sense, suddenly find that they have to compete with women who, by the way, are outclassing men on a very broad societal scale, like for example, who's getting into college and university, who's getting those good jobs when they come out of college and university. Men are falling back in certain ways a lot because of this sense of you know what's been called in the literature aggrieved entitlement. So this goes on all over the place, and this is certainly going on in American society, on a broad scale, where the fear on the right, the fear of Stephen Miller et al., that suddenly they will not be in charge. They'll have to make accommodations to these people that deep in their hearts they know are inferior. This kind of thing isn't at the moment, I don't think permanently, I don't think America is that vulnerable to this as it might seem at the moment, but I hope I'm right about that. At the moment, and these are the folks in. Now, how is Stephen Miller going to carry out his little program? There's, what, 65 million Latino Hispanics in the United States. I'm pulling that number out of my head, and I might be wrong. There's something like 45 million Black folk in the United States. I'm not sure about the Asian numbers or the Native American numbers. That's a whole lot of people to put down. That's a whole lot of people to intern or deport. So it's not even, I think, what's going on. I think what's going on is what you might call showing the flag, showing who's in charge here, baby. And don't you dare dispute it. Don't you dare claim diversity is important, equity, inclusion. We never included you up till now. We're going to start now. That's the kind of undercurrent of the current political situation. And basically, all politics is like that. We don't necessarily need to wipe out everybody or jail everybody. We just have to show who's boss. So there's a tremendous logic to that. It's very powerful. I mean, Trump is unpopular now, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows where it's going to come out? But of course, I fear, and I think many people, maybe a majority of people in this country are coming to fear that repressive logic is unstoppable. I don't think it is, but I fear that it might be. And that repressive logic can destroy the country.
I think what's really interesting, yeah, I mean, we talked about the notion of color blindness. I think the term of the hour is actually wokeism, being woke. And I think that let us look at our just recent political history, the upsurges, the tremendous thing, not only on a national but international scale, precipitated by the murder of George Floyd, or as well as other folks who have been killed. The kind of ways in which even corporate America was trying to talk about DEI initiatives or direct sort of economic kinds of infusions to particularly for these marginalized racial communities, and how that's completely been transformed. Now everybody's scared about being woke. You don't want to be accused of being woke, because the woke is suggestive that somehow you're not with the sort of overall sort of program or agenda that is trying to argue for moving us towards a colorblind society. It's a call for us to become a divisive kind of society, and it's a form of rearticulation too, and it's a ways in being dismissive around any sort of self-consciousness about race, racial disparities, racial identities, collective racial movements. It's And it's really transforming broad swatches of our lives.
I just wrote an essay on woke, and I called it "Stay Woke." I don't know. A lot of people in Cleveland, hey, people in Cleveland who are looking at this interview, did you put up a sign on your lawn or on your apartment door that said, "In this house we believe, Black Lives Matter, women should control the," I don't remember all the phraseology.
Science is real.
Their own bodies. Nature needs to be protected. Look down that list. All people are equal. Immigrants should have rights as much as whites. I'm not as much as natives. I'm not sure what all the language was, but that's woke. And if you put that sign up, or if you sympathize with that sign as you were walking down the street, think about what that means about you. That means you're not so much in danger. You're not so threatened. You're more confident in yourself. You're more confident in your country. You're more confident in ideas of social justice and equality and freedom. You don't need to put someone else down, to punish someone else in order to feel good about yourself. So woke is something that I think is just it's just a stand-in word for freedom. And people have not recognized that yet, but they will, because we recognized it just 5 years ago in the George Floyd protests.
Thanks for listening to the Unpacking 1619. For more information on Heights Library's 1619 Project discussion group, or to check out more interviews with scholars, please visit heightslibrary.org. See you next episode, wherever you listen to podcasts.